Welcome back to the Grave of the Shadows. Before we begin, a huge thanks for your support. If you love the mystery, make sure to subscribe and hit that bell. Now, dim the lights, and let's dive into tonight's chilling tale. In the autumn of 1823, a small, quiet town in Pennsylvania became the center of a nightmare that would remain hidden for nearly a century. Millbrook, a community nestled deep in the rolling hills of southeastern Pennsylvania, was like many other small towns of the time, isolated, peaceful, and close-knit. But in the midst of this serenity, a dark secret was brewing, one that would shock the town's residents to their core and leave an indelible mark on its history. The story begins with the Hartwell family, who had been running a funeral home in Millbrook for over 2 decades. At first glance, the Hartwell funeral parlor appeared to be a well-respected establishment, trusted by the local community for its compassionate care of the deceased and its willingness to serve even the poorest families. The family, led by patriarch Ezekiel Hartwell, had built a reputation for professionalism and respectability, a reputation that had earned them the trust of every resident in the town. But beneath the surface of this seemingly respectable family business, something far more sinister was at play. The Hartwells weren't just preparing bodies for burial, they were actively involved in the deaths they were supposed to be handling. For years, they had been systematically murdering individuals and turning their deaths into a profitable business. And in 1823, their carefully hidden operation was about to be exposed. It all began with a routine health inspection by Dr. Samuel Harrison, a traveling physician employed by the state to monitor the health of rural communities. Dr. Harrison had conducted similar inspections in towns across Pennsylvania, but nothing could prepare him for what he would find in Millbrook. His visit to the Hartwell funeral parlor, which was supposed to be a simple checkup, would uncover a web of deceit, murder, and unimaginable horrors that would change the town and his life forever. As Dr. Harrison arrived in Millbrook, the town appeared as it always did, quiet, peaceful, and unassuming. With a population of fewer than 300, Millbrook had remained largely untouched by the rapid industrialization sweeping through the United States. Life was simple here. People knew each other by name, and trust was the foundation of every relationship. In such a community, it was hard to imagine that a family, so ingrained in the fabric of the town, could be capable of such monstrous acts. The Hartwells, who had arrived in Millbrook in 1801, were the picture of respectability. Ezekiel Hartwell had purchased a large stone house on the outskirts of town and transformed it into the area's first dedicated funeral parlor. Before the Hartwells, families had either taken care of their own deceased or relied on local carpenters to build coffins. Ezekiel's professional approach was initially met with skepticism by some, but his fair prices and respectful manner quickly won over the townspeople. He was seen as a man of integrity, and his funeral home became a cornerstone of Millbrook's social life. Living with Ezekiel were his wife, Martha, their 3 children, Josiah, Caleb, and Rebecca, and Martha's elderly father, Thomas Creed. Together, they ran the funeral parlor as a family business, with each member playing a crucial role. Josiah, at 26, had learned the art of embalming from his father and was expected to take over the business. Caleb, 23, assisted with carpentry and grave digging, while Rebecca, just 19, helped her mother with domestic duties and comforted grieving families. Martha's reputation for kindness and charity further solidified the family's place in the community. The funeral home, a 3-story stone building, was both the family's residence and business. The ground floor was used for viewing the deceased, while the upper floors served as the family's living quarters. The basement, however, was a different story. It had been converted into an embalming room, where the bodies of the deceased were prepared for burial. This hidden space, far removed from the rest of the home, would soon become the epicenter of the Hartwell family's dark practices. As the Hartwells became increasingly trusted by the town, they began to serve more and more families, handling nearly every death within a 15-mile radius. They were known for their willingness to offer services even to those who could not afford to pay, sometimes accepting food or labor in exchange for burial services. This generosity earned them the gratitude and loyalty of the town, and by 1823, the Hartwells were seen as pillars of the community. But this outward appearance of respectability masked a much darker truth. The very trust that had made the Hartwells so beloved had also created the perfect environment for their deadly operation. As their reputation grew, so too did their access to the vulnerable, the sick, and the elderly, people who would never be missed when they vanished. And as Dr. Harrison would soon discover, the Hartwells were not just funeral directors. They were serial killers hiding in plain sight. Millbrook, Pennsylvania, was a town where everyone knew everyone. Nestled in the rolling hills of southeastern Pennsylvania, the town was a snapshot of early 19th century rural life, where simplicity and tradition reigned supreme. With a population of fewer than 300 people, Millbrook had little connection to the rapidly industrializing world beyond its borders. Life here was slow and steady, focused on farming, logging, and the occasional traveler passing through on their way to somewhere else. The people of Millbrook were known for their close-knit relationships, relying heavily on one another to survive and thrive. Trust was the foundation of their community, and neighbors often worked together on projects like barn raisings, shared meals, and even the burial of their loved ones. Everyone had a role to play, and it was this mutual dependence that made the town so deeply connected. But in a town like Millbrook, where the line between close friendship and trusting family ties could sometimes blur, the community was ill-prepared for the nightmare that was about to unfold. The Hartwell family arrived in Millbrook in 1801, and their story quickly became intertwined with the town's. Ezekiel Hartwell, the patriarch of the family, was a man who appeared to embody the ideals of hard work and integrity. A skilled carpenter from Western Virginia, Ezekiel had purchased a large stone house on the outskirts of town, a property that would soon serve as both the family's home and their business. The house was nestled on a small hill, away from the hustle and bustle of the town center, but still close enough to serve as a beacon of respectability. Ezekiel saw an opportunity in Millbrook. While the town had been relying on its local carpenters to build coffins and families to handle their own burial preparations, Ezekiel believed that a professional funeral home could provide a much-needed service. He was not the first to think of this idea, but he would be the first to execute it with such precision. His funeral home was clean, organized, and well-kept, and Ezekiel's reputation for being compassionate and thorough in his work quickly spread through the town. At first, the idea of a professional funeral director seemed strange to some of the townspeople. In a community that valued tradition, the concept of outsourcing burial services to an outsider was met with skepticism. But Ezekiel's commitment to professionalism and fair pricing won over even the most hesitant residents. His funeral parlor, the Hartwell Funeral Parlor, became a fixture in the town, and as the years passed, it became the go-to place for funeral services. Ezekiel's wife, Martha, was equally respected in the town. Known for her warm heart and charitable nature, she was a fixture at community events, often seen bringing pies to families in mourning or offering her services to those in need. Martha's reputation for kindness only added to the family's standing in Millbrook. People trusted the Hartwells, not only with their loved ones but with their very lives. They were seen as pillars of the community, an example of what a family business should be. Together, Ezekiel and Martha raised 3 children: Josiah, Caleb, and Rebecca. Josiah, the eldest at 26, had already learned the art of embalming from his father and was expected to take over the business one day. He was quiet but meticulous in his work, learning the funeral trade from his father's careful instruction. Caleb, at 23, was the more active of the 2 sons, assisting with carpentry and grave digging, ensuring that each burial was handled with the utmost care. Caleb's work ethic was admired by many in the town, and his hands were always busy, whether building coffins or helping with the day-to-day operations of the funeral home. Rebecca, the youngest, at just 19, was a delicate soul. She helped her mother with domestic chores, but her true gift lay in comforting grieving families. Known for her gentle manner and compassionate heart, Rebecca became the face of the Hartwell Funeral Parlor when families needed solace during their darkest moments. Her ability to ease the pain of loss was unmatched, and many families turned to her for support, believing that Rebecca was a symbol of the care and respect the Hartwells brought to their work. As time passed, the Hartwell Funeral Parlor grew in both prominence and business. By 1823, The funeral home was handling nearly every death within a 15-mile radius of Millbrook. Their reputation for honesty, integrity, and compassion made them beloved by all. People trusted the Hartwells to take care of their loved ones, and the family often offered services in exchange for food, labor, or other goods when a family was struggling financially. This generosity further cemented their place in the community. The funeral home was a 3-story stone building with a wooden addition at the back. The main floor was used for the viewing of the deceased, while the upper floors served as the family's living quarters. A narrow staircase led down to the basement, where the embalming room was located. This basement was, for all intents and purposes, the heart of the funeral parlor. It was where the dead were prepared for burial, where their bodies were washed, dressed, and embalmed. It was a space of quiet, somber work, designed to offer dignity and respect to those who had passed. But unbeknownst to the people of Millbrook, this very basement would soon become the center of a horrific secret, one that would take decades to uncover. The trust the town had in the Hartwells was not just based on their reputation for professional service, but on the Hartwell family's reputation as good, honest people. In Millbrook, where everyone knew each other, it was almost impossible to believe that such a respected family could be capable of such unspeakable acts. But as we'll soon learn, the Hartwell family's outward appearance of respectability was nothing but a facade, one that hid the darkest of secrets. Dr. Samuel Harrison was no stranger to small towns. A seasoned traveling physician employed by the state, he had made his rounds through Pennsylvania's rural communities for years, ensuring that sanitary practices were followed, inspecting burial sites, and monitoring outbreaks of diseases. His visits were routine, often involving little more than a quick check of water sources, food storage, and burial practices. But when Dr. Harrison arrived in Millbrook on October 15, 1823, he had no idea that his visit would unearth a secret so horrifying that it would shake the very foundations of the town. Millbrook, like many small towns, was used to the occasional inspection. But Dr. Harrison wasn't just any physician. His work was critical in preventing disease outbreaks, especially after the cholera epidemic that had ravaged parts of Pennsylvania just a few years earlier. The townspeople were used to his visits, and the Hartwell family, having worked with local officials on several occasions, knew exactly what to expect. When Dr. Harrison arrived in Millbrook, he was greeted by Ezekiel Hartwell and his son Josiah, who both seemed eager to show him their facilities. At first glance, everything appeared in perfect order. The Hartwell funeral parlor was spotless, its rooms well-maintained, and the family's respect for their work was evident. Ezekiel and Josiah led Dr. Harrison through the funeral home, proudly displaying their embalming equipment and the preparation rooms where the deceased were prepared for burial. Everything was as it should be, or so it seemed. Dr. Harrison's role during these inspections was simple. He was to ensure that the bodies were being handled properly, in accordance with the health regulations that had been put in place after the cholera outbreaks. While it wasn't uncommon for him to request to examine some bodies, this time something felt different. The moment Dr. Harrison stepped into the funeral home, he sensed a certain tension in the air. The Hartwells were being unusually accommodating, almost too eager to show him everything, as if they were trying to ensure that no stone was left unturned. It wasn't until Dr. Harrison requested to examine the bodies that things began to feel truly off. There were 3 bodies in the funeral home, each being prepared for burial later that week. The first body was that of Elenina Fairchild, a 68-year-old widow who had allegedly died from consumption or tuberculosis just 3 days earlier. The moment Dr. Harrison began his examination, he noticed something unsettling. Faint bruising marks along Elenina's neck, hidden just beneath the high collar of her burial dress. The marks were subtle, but unmistakable. They resembled the type of bruises one might find after manual strangulation, not the telltale signs of a wasting disease like consumption. When Dr. Harrison pointed this out to Josiah, he was quick to offer an explanation. "She must have been positioned awkwardly during the embalming process," he suggested, his voice a little shaky. It was a reasonable enough explanation, but there was something in Josiah's tone, the way his eyes avoided direct contact, that made Dr. Harrison uneasy. Still, he dismissed it as a simple mistake, attributing the bruising to the embalming process. But the more Dr. Harrison examined the bodies, the more unsettling the situation became. The second body belonged to Marcus Webb, a 42-year-old farmer who had allegedly died of a heart attack while working in his fields. But when Dr. Harrison inspected Marcus's body, he discovered something far more disturbing: small, precise puncture wounds on Marcus's arms and chest. They were too clean, too deliberate to be accidental. When Dr. Harrison questioned Ezekiel about these wounds, he received a quick and almost too practiced response. Marcus must have fallen onto some farming tools during his collapse, Ezekiel claimed, but Dr. Harrison knew this explanation didn't hold up. The wounds were too exact, too purposeful. The third body was that of Mary Patterson, a 26-year-old mother of two who had allegedly died of a fever after a short illness. Dr. Harrison's examination revealed something even more disturbing. Around Mary's mouth and fingernails, there was a white powdery residue. His medical training immediately recognized the substance arsenic. Arsenic was commonly used in rural areas to kill rodents, but it was also a deadly poison. Dr. Harrison's suspicions grew stronger, and he began to piece together a chilling reality. These bodies weren't just being prepared for burial. They had been manipulated, altered in ways that suggested foul play. The more Dr. Harrison dug into the bodies, the more convinced he became that something sinister was happening at the Hartwell funeral parlor. But it wasn't just the bodies that disturbed him. It was the strange behavior of the Hartwell family. Their overly accommodating demeanor, the coldness that had replaced the initial warmth, and the way they exchanged glances when he discovered the oddities made him feel like an outsider in their tightly knit operation. As Dr. Harrison continued his examination, he felt a sense of dread creep over him. It was clear that something was terribly wrong, but at the same time he was caught in a difficult position. The Hartwells had been pillars of the community for over 2 decades. They were trusted, respected, and beloved by everyone in town. The idea that they could be responsible for such atrocities seemed impossible. Yet the evidence before him was undeniable. Dr. Harrison's suspicions grew, and he knew he had to dig deeper. It wasn't long before the unease he felt turned into a firm belief that the Hartwell family was hiding something, a truth far darker than anyone in Millbrook could have imagined. As Dr. Harrison continued his examination of the bodies at the Hartwell funeral parlor, the unsettling feeling that had been building in him began to crystallize into something undeniable. The bruises on Elenina Fairchild's neck, the puncture wounds on Marcus Webb's chest, and the traces of arsenic on Mary Patterson's body were too much to ignore. Something was wrong, terribly wrong, but it wasn't enough for him to act just yet. His medical training had taught him to remain objective, to consider every possible explanation before jumping to conclusions. Still, there was an instinct in him, a gnawing sensation at the back of his mind, that told him he needed to dig deeper. The Hartwells had been kind to him during his visit, almost too kind. Their eagerness to show him their facilities, their willingness to explain away the oddities, all felt staged, rehearsed. It was as though they had been expecting someone like him, and they knew exactly how to cover their tracks. Dr. Harrison's suspicion grew, but he wasn't ready to confront the family directly. Instead, he decided to continue his examination, quietly observing the rest of the funeral home. Perhaps he had missed something. Perhaps there was an explanation for all of it that he had yet to uncover. So, he carefully examined the embalming room, the preparation tables, and the tools used by the Hartwells in their work. Everything appeared clean, well-maintained, almost too perfect. There were no signs of the disorganization or carelessness that might have explained the oddities he had found in the bodies. But there was one thing that caught his eye, something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. Behind one of the embalming tables, partially obscured by a stack of burial clothes, Dr. Harrison noticed a leather-bound journal. It wasn't the kind of thing one would expect to find in a professional funeral home. The journal was old, worn, and filled with notes in multiple hands. It appeared to be a record of sorts, but it wasn't a ledger or a logbook that tracked funeral arrangements. No, this journal was something far more sinister. As Dr. Harrison reached for it, a chill ran down his spine. The journal was heavy, and when he opened it, He found pages filled with detailed entries about individuals who had died in Millbrook over the years. The entries weren't just about the deceased. They contained detailed notes about their health, their financial status, their families, and in some cases, their vulnerabilities. The more Dr. Harrison read, the more disturbed he became. The journal appeared to be a meticulous record of the Hartwell's activities, but it wasn't just a business ledger. It was a catalog of the family's victims. Each entry was marked with specific details about how the individuals had died, with the methods of death described in cold, clinical terms. There were mentions of various poisons, including arsenic, and of specific ways in which the bodies were prepared to avoid suspicion. The entries read like a twisted experiment, with the Hartwells treating death like something to be studied and perfected, rather than something to be mourned. Dr. Harrison's hands trembled as he flipped through the pages. The journal described victims in great detail, highlighting their weaknesses, their isolation, and their need for assistance. It was clear that the Hartwells had been targeting the vulnerable, those who would not be missed, and those whose deaths would not raise suspicions. The journal's entries grew more disturbing as they continued, documenting a series of carefully orchestrated murders. What was even more chilling was the realization that the journal wasn't just about the past. It was still being written. There were recent entries, some of which seemed to correspond with the very bodies Dr. Harrison had examined earlier. The notes about Elenina Fairchild, Marcus Webb, and Mary Patterson were detailed, as if the family had been tracking their every move. There were even notes on how to handle the bodies to avoid detection, how to position them, what to say to the families, and how to explain away the cause of death. As Dr. Harrison read, the room seemed to close in on him. The walls of the funeral parlor, which had once seemed so warm and inviting, now felt cold and suffocating. He could feel the weight of the journal in his hands, like a tangible representation of the darkness that had been hidden in plain sight for so long. The Hartwells had not just been preparing bodies. They had been creating victims, manipulating lives, and orchestrating murders for years. And now, Dr. Harrison had stumbled upon the truth. But as he began to close the journal, he heard footsteps approaching. His heart raced. He knew that if he was caught with this journal, it would be the end of everything. The Hartwells would never let him leave alive. With trembling hands, he quickly shoved the journal back under the stack of burial clothes and tried to steady his breath. His mind raced, but he knew he had to act quickly. He had to get out of the funeral home before the family returned. But as Dr. Harrison moved toward the door, he realized something that made his stomach churn with fear. The journal was only the beginning. If what he had uncovered so far was true, then the Hartwells had been operating a killing operation for years, an operation that had been hidden from the community for far too long. The weight of the discovery settled in his chest, and he knew that exposing the Hartwell family's secret would not be easy. In fact, it might cost him his life. As Dr. Harrison tucked the journal back under the burial clothes, his heart pounded in his chest. Every instinct told him to leave the funeral parlor and report his findings to the authorities. But the overwhelming fear of what would happen if he were caught, coupled with the undeniable reality that the Hartwells were far more dangerous than he had first realized, kept him rooted to the spot. He had come to Millbrook expecting to perform a routine inspection, but what he had uncovered was far beyond anything he had ever anticipated. The journal he had found painted a horrifying picture of the Hartwell family, a family that had carefully and methodically orchestrated the deaths of countless innocent individuals, all in the name of profit and twisted experimentation. But it was the behavior of the Hartwells themselves that truly sent chills down Dr. Harrison's spine. As he stood in the funeral parlor, his mind raced with questions. How had they managed to operate so openly for so long? How had they hidden their crimes so well? As he stood frozen in the embalming room, Dr. Harrison's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. The family had returned. Ezekiel, Josiah, Caleb, and Rebecca entered the room, their faces mask-like in their composure. But to Dr. Harrison, something was off. The warmth that had initially greeted him was gone, replaced by an icy coldness that seemed to radiate from each of them. Ezekiel was the first to speak. "Dr. Harrison, I trust your examination of the bodies went well?" he asked, his voice smooth and even. But there was an underlying tension in his tone. an almost imperceptible shift that made Dr. Harrison's blood run cold. "Yes, everything is in order," Dr. Harrison replied, trying to maintain a calm facade, though his nerves were on edge. He glanced at the family, noticing that they were standing just a little too close together. It was as if they were all in on a secret that Dr. Harrison had just begun to uncover. Josiah, the eldest son, was particularly unsettling. He had been the one to explain away the bruises on Elenina Fairchild's neck earlier, offering the flimsy excuse that she had been positioned awkwardly during the embalming process. But now, as he stood next to his father, his eyes darted nervously around the room. There was something about the way he avoided Dr. Harrison's gaze that suggested he knew more than he was letting on. Caleb, the youngest son, was no better. His normally jovial demeanor had been replaced by a tense, almost predatory air. He stood near the back of the room, his arms crossed over his chest, watching Dr. Harrison with an intensity that made the physician feel as though he were being hunted. Rebecca, too, seemed different. The once gentle girl who had comforted grieving families now appeared cold and calculating. Her eyes, which had once been filled with compassion, were now sharp and observant. Dr. Harrison noticed that she was watching him closely, studying his every move, as if waiting for him to slip up, to reveal something he had yet to see. The family's behavior was no longer that of a respected business running a funeral parlor. They were no longer the kind, caring figures that the town had come to rely on. They had become a united front, a team bound together by a dark secret that none of them were willing to let go. Dr. Harrison's unease grew with every passing moment. He could feel the walls closing in on him, the weight of the family's presence pressing down on him. He had always prided himself on his ability to remain calm in difficult situations, but now he was struggling to keep his composure. The subtle changes in the Hartwell's demeanor told him everything he needed to know. They were aware of his suspicions, and they were ready to do whatever it took to protect their secret. "Is there anything else we can help you with, Dr. Harrison?" Ezekiel's voice was smooth, but there was an edge to it now, something that hadn't been there before. It was as though he were daring Dr. Harrison to make a move. "No, I think everything is in order," Dr. Harrison replied, forcing a smile, though his mind was racing. He knew he couldn't stay any longer. The longer he remained in the Hartwell funeral parlor, the more dangerous it became. He had already seen enough to know that the family was involved in something far darker than he could have ever imagined. But as he turned to leave, something in the air shifted. The family's eyes followed him, their gazes unwavering, as if they were waiting for him to make a mistake. And just before he exited the room, Dr. Harrison caught a glimpse of something in Josiah's eyes. A cold, calculating look that sent a shiver down his spine. It was in that moment that Dr. Harrison realized the truth. The Hartwells weren't just hiding their crimes from the community. They were hiding something far more dangerous from him. And he was walking out of their funeral home with no idea just how far they would go to keep their secrets buried. As Dr. Harrison left the funeral parlor that day, he knew one thing for certain. The Hartwell family was not just hiding a business. They were hiding a legacy of murder. The air around Millbrook had begun to feel thicker, as if the town itself had been holding its breath. Dr. Harrison had left the Hartwell funeral parlor with his mind in turmoil. The family's unsettling behavior, coupled with the discoveries he had already made, left him on the edge of both dread and disbelief. He had hoped that his suspicions were wrong, that there was some rational explanation for the bruises, the puncture wounds, and the arsenic. But now, with the family's cold reaction to his findings, there was no denying the truth. The journal had shaken him to his core. Its pages, filled with meticulous entries about deaths and their methods, confirmed what he had feared. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that he couldn't leave Millbrook without uncovering the full extent of the Hartwell's operations. He had already seen too much to turn back now. That evening, Dr. Harrison went over his notes in the small room at the inn where he was staying. His mind raced as he tried to piece together everything he had observed. The peculiarities with the bodies, the unsettling behavior of the Hartwell family, and, most importantly, the journal. It was clear that the Hartwells had been killing for years, but what still eluded him was the full scope of their operation. How many had they murdered? What was their motivation? Were they working with someone else? Or was this all the work of a single, twisted family? Dr. Harrison knew he needed to dig deeper, and so, early the next morning, he made his way back to the funeral parlor. He had to see more. He had to find more. The basement, the embalming room, had already revealed disturbing signs, but he knew there was more to uncover. The family's strange behavior had only confirmed his suspicions. They were hiding something. When he arrived at the Hartwell funeral parlor, the family was nowhere to be found. It was early, and the family had likely gone out to attend church, a routine they followed without fail on Sundays. This was Dr. Harrison's chance. He could finally examine the funeral home without the prying eyes of the family on him. He made his way to the basement, the heart of the funeral parlor, where the bodies were prepared. The stairs creaked under his weight as he descended into the dimly lit room. The air was thick with the smell of chemicals, formaldehyde, embalming fluid, and something foul, that made Dr. Harrison's stomach churn. It was in the embalming room that the Hartwells had carried out their twisted work, and it was here that Dr. Harrison would begin his search for the truth. As he scanned the room, his eyes fell on the shelves stacked with glass jars filled with various chemical solutions. Some contained what appeared to be human organs, liver, lungs, and intestines, all meticulously preserved in liquid. But it was the freshness of the organs that struck Dr. Harrison. They were not the preserved remnants of bodies that had been embalmed, as one might expect. These organs appeared recent, far too recent to be part of the normal embalming process. Some were even sliced open with surgical precision, as if they had been removed for study. Dr. Harrison's heart pounded in his chest. This wasn't just embalming. This was something else entirely. The organs, the surgical tools, the careful preservation. These were signs of an experiment, a grotesque experiment carried out on the bodies of the deceased. The more he looked, the more horrified he became. The Hartwells weren't just killing, they were conducting medical experiments, experimenting with the bodies in ways that defied all ethical boundaries. It was then that Dr. Harrison noticed something else, something that sent a shiver down his spine. In the corner of the room, partially hidden behind a stack of burial clothes, was a leather-bound journal. He recognized it immediately, the same journal he had seen earlier, but this time it was open. As he approached, his eyes were drawn to the pages, which were filled with notes detailing the family's experiments. The entries were chilling. One particular entry stood out to Dr. Harrison. It was about a man named Thomas Creed, Martha Hartwell's elderly father. The journal detailed how Thomas had become a subject of the family's experiments after his health had begun to decline. The entries described how Martha had been feeding him a steady diet of poisons, slowly weakening him to see how long it would take for him to succumb. The family had been observing his reactions, noting the progression of his symptoms, and recording the changes in his health as they administered various toxic substances. Thomas Creed was not the first, and he wouldn't be the last. The journal entries revealed a pattern, one that was as methodical as it was horrific. The Hartwells had been killing not out of necessity or revenge, but out of a twisted desire to experiment, to test the limits of human suffering and death. The victims had been carefully selected, often the elderly, the sick, or those with few connections to the outside world. The family knew that their deaths would not be investigated, that they would simply disappear, their lives snuffed out with little notice. Dr. Harrison's stomach turned as he read further. The Hartwells had developed a system for selecting their victims based on their vulnerabilities. They had learned to choose individuals who were isolated, who had no one to speak for them. They were experts at identifying the weak and the vulnerable, and they had turned their funeral parlor into a place where death was not only an end, but a tool for their dark experiments. But the most disturbing discovery came when Dr. Harrison turned the page and saw a detailed map. The map showed the location of a mass grave, a burial site hidden deep in the woods behind the Hartwell property. The journal indicated that this was where the family disposed of the bodies of their victims, those whose deaths could not be easily explained or whose bodies showed signs of foul play. The weight of what Dr. Harrison had discovered hit him all at once. The Hartwell funeral parlor was not a place of care. It was a house of horrors, a killing ground where the family's darkest desires had been realized. And now Dr. Harrison had the evidence to prove it. As he closed the journal and tucked it under his arm, Dr. Harrison knew that his next steps were crucial. He had to get out of the funeral parlor, but he also had to make sure the evidence was protected. The family would not let him leave without doing whatever they could to stop him. Dr. Harrison stood in the dimly lit basement of the Hartwell funeral parlor, the weight of what he had uncovered pressing down on him like a heavy stone. His hands shook as he carefully placed the leather-bound journal back where he had found it, under the stack of burial clothes. He had seen enough to know the truth. The Hartwell family was not just running a funeral home. They were running a killing operation, a grotesque series of experiments hidden in plain sight. They had been methodically selecting their victims for years, using their funeral home as a cover for their twisted acts. But now the hardest part lay ahead. Dr. Harrison had no doubts about what he had uncovered, but he also knew that exposing the truth would not be easy. The Hartwells were not strangers to the town. They were beloved members of the Millbrook community, trusted and respected by every family in town. To accuse them of such monstrous acts would be to tear apart the very fabric of Millbrook itself. The town had relied on the Hartwells for over 2 decades. The idea that these trusted pillars of the community could be responsible for a series of murders was beyond comprehension. Dr. Harrison knew that his next steps would require courage, but he was also painfully aware of the consequences. The Hartwells had been careful in their operations. They had known how to cover their tracks, how to make their victims disappear without raising suspicion. If he were to expose them, the community would not be ready to believe him. How could they? They had witnessed the Hartwells' kindness, their generosity, their professionalism. They had seen the family work tirelessly to serve the community, often offering their services to those in need. To accuse them now, with no hard evidence beyond what he had seen in the funeral home, would likely lead to nothing more than doubt and disbelief. Yet, Dr. Harrison could not shake the images of the bodies, the preserved organs, the detailed journal. He had seen the evidence with his own eyes. The Hartwell family was guilty of crimes that went far beyond anything he had ever encountered in his career. The lives of those they had taken, lives that had been cut short and manipulated, now weighed heavily on his conscience. He could not, in good faith, allow their murders to go unpunished. As he walked out of the funeral parlor, the crisp morning air hit him like a slap in the face. Millbrook was a town of simplicity, where everyone knew everyone, and death was an accepted part of life. But now, with the knowledge of what the Hartwells had done, it felt like the ground beneath his feet had shifted. Millbrook, a town that had once felt so safe and secure, now seemed haunted. How many families had buried their loved ones without ever questioning the true cause of death? How many people had trusted the Hartwells with the final moments of their loved ones, never suspecting that the very hands preparing the bodies had been responsible for taking those lives in the first place? Dr. Harrison knew he couldn't leave without doing something. But the town was so tightly bound by the Hartwells' reputation that any accusation would be met with resistance. The family had been part of Millbrook's life for too long, and it would be impossible to convince the town of the truth without solid, irrefutable evidence. The physician spent the next several days struggling with his dilemma. Should he report the Hartwells to the authorities, or should he leave Millbrook and never speak of what he had seen? The fear of retaliation from the Hartwell family loomed large in his mind. He had no doubt that they would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. But he also knew that to remain silent would mean betraying the very people they had murdered, people who had trusted the Hartwells with their final moments. Dr. Harrison's internal conflict reached its peak one afternoon when he was approached by a group of Millbrook's residents. Word had spread about his visit to the Hartwell funeral parlor, and the townspeople were eager to know what he had found. At first, Dr. Harrison hesitated. How could he explain what he had uncovered without causing panic, without tearing the town apart? The residents, however, were insistent. They had noticed the changes in the Hartwell family's behavior, the oddness of the recent deaths in the town, and the strange way the family had begun to act in the past few weeks. The people of Millbrook were not blind, after all. They knew that something was wrong. Dr. Harrison found himself in a precarious position. If he spoke up now, the family would likely retaliate, and there was no guarantee that the townspeople would believe him. But if he remained silent, he would be complicit in the cover-up of their crimes. With a heavy heart, Dr. Harrison made the decision to speak. He could not, in good conscience, let the Hartwells continue their killing spree, nor could he allow their legacy of murder to be buried forever. But even as he spoke to the residents, Dr. Harrison knew that exposing the truth would be far from simple. The community would be torn, divided between loyalty to the Hartwells and the undeniable reality of what had transpired under their roof. He told the townspeople what he had found: the bodies, the organs, the journal, and while some of them listened in shock and disbelief, others refused to accept the truth. The idea that the Hartwells, a family so trusted, could be responsible for such horrific acts seemed impossible. Dr. Harrison could see the doubt in their eyes, and he knew that it would take more than his word to convince them. But he had no choice. He had to try. The townspeople promised to take the matter to the local authorities, but Dr. Harrison knew that it wouldn't be easy. The Hartwells had powerful allies, and their influence in Millbrook ran deep. The town would be forced to reckon with the truth, whether it was ready or not. As Dr. Harrison walked away from the group of residents, his heart weighed heavy. The journey ahead was uncertain, and he could only hope that, in the end, justice would prevail. But he knew that the truth was now out in the open, and Millbrook could never go back to the way it had been before. The days following Dr. Harrison's revelation to the townspeople were tense, filled with whispered conversations and furtive glances. Millbrook, a town once known for its tight-knit community, had become a battleground between the shocking truths uncovered by Dr. Harrison and the loyalty the town still held for the Hartwell family. While some residents were horrified and eager to act, others refused to believe that the Hartwells, whom they had trusted for over 2 decades, could be responsible for such atrocities. In the wake of his disclosure, Dr. Harrison realized that the investigation into the Hartwell family's crimes had only just begun. The town, now aware of the dark secrets hiding behind the Hartwell funeral parlor's respectable facade, had little idea just how deeply the family's sinister actions had been intertwined with the history of Millbrook itself. The more Dr. Harrison delved into the family's past, the more horrifying truths he uncovered, truths that painted a chilling picture of the Hartwells' true intentions and the twisted nature of their crimes. Dr. Harrison's first clue came when he spoke to some of the town's oldest residents. They had known the Hartwells from the very beginning, from the moment Ezekiel Hartwell had arrived in Millbrook in 1801. The stories they shared were both enlightening and disturbing. As it turned out, the Hartwells had not always been the well-respected funeral directors they appeared to be. Their arrival in Millbrook had raised suspicions, and many residents had been wary of their motives. Ezekiel Hartwell, the patriarch of the family, had arrived in town claiming to have learned the funeral trade from an uncle in Richmond, Virginia. He had purchased a property on the outskirts of Millbrook, a large stone house, and transformed it into the town's first dedicated funeral parlor. The residents of Millbrook had initially viewed him with suspicion, as funeral services were traditionally handled by the town's carpenters and local families. But Ezekiel's professional approach, his fair pricing, and his compassionate demeanor soon won over the community. What the townspeople didn't know was that Ezekiel's true intentions went far beyond offering a service to the grieving families of Millbrook. As Dr. Harrison dug deeper, he learned that the first winter the Hartwells spent in Millbrook had been marked by an outbreak of a mysterious illness. The illness, described by town records as a wasting sickness, claimed 8 lives, each one of whom had been prepared for burial by the newly established Hartwell funeral parlor. At the time, it was considered a coincidence, an unfortunate tragedy that befell the town during a particularly harsh winter. But Dr. Harrison began to see a pattern. The sickness had struck at the same time that the Hartwells had opened their funeral home, and Dr. Harrison began to suspect that the family might have been involved in the deaths. Were these early victims the first targets in a carefully orchestrated plan? Had Ezekiel Hartwell, with his knowledge of death and embalming, used his position to take advantage of the most vulnerable in the town? The more Dr. Harrison thought about it, the more he realized that the wasting sickness could have been a cover for the Hartwells' first attempts at manipulating life and death. Dr. Harrison also spoke to several families who had used the Hartwell services in the early years. Many of them recalled how quickly their loved ones had seemed to deteriorate once the Hartwells began to offer their assistance. One particularly disturbing account came from Sarah Peton, whose elderly mother had died just 2 weeks before Dr. Harrison's arrival. Sarah told the physician that her mother had been in good health and spirits until Martha Hartwell began visiting her regularly, bringing homemade soup and offering comfort during a minor bout of joint pain. Within days of these visits, Sarah's mother had fallen violently ill and died before a doctor could be summoned. Sarah's account mirrored the pattern that Dr. Harrison had been piecing together. The Hartwells had targeted those who were vulnerable, those who were isolated, and those whose deaths would be easily explained away. The journal Dr. Harrison had discovered in the funeral parlor also revealed shocking details about the family's early years in Millbrook. The entries chronicled the beginning of their killing spree, and it became evident that the Hartwells had learned quickly how to identify their targets. They had perfected the art of selecting individuals who would not be missed, who had no close family to question their deaths. The journal entries even described their methods: poisoning, suffocation, and, in some cases, surgical experiments, used to ensure that their victims' deaths appeared natural. The family had, over the years, developed a meticulous system for conducting their killings, and their funeral home became the perfect cover for their activities. Dr. Harrison's investigation revealed that the Hartwells had not simply been motivated by financial gain. Their actions were driven by a twisted, almost scientific obsession with death. The journal entries were filled with detailed notes about the effects of various poisons on the human body, the ways in which different individuals reacted to fear and pain, and the family's experiments with surgical procedures on living victims. It was clear that the Hartwells saw death not as an end, but as a process to be studied, dissected, and perfected. In a particularly chilling entry, Josiah Hartwell wrote about an experiment he had conducted on Marcus Webb, one of the bodies Dr. Harrison had examined earlier. Josiah described how Marcus had been selected because he was a widower with no close family, and how he had been lured to the funeral home under the pretense of purchasing a coffin for a recently deceased neighbor. Once inside, Marcus had been overpowered and subjected to what the journal euphemistically called experimental procedures. Josiah's entry detailed how Marcus had been tortured before being killed, his body staged to suggest a heart attack. The entry ended with a chilling note about the family's ongoing experiments. "We are learning much from these procedures. The possibilities are endless." As Dr. Harrison pieced together these disturbing accounts, it became clear that the Hartwell family's operation had been far more sophisticated than anyone had imagined. They had not just been killing for money, they had been conducting experiments on their victims, studying death in ways that no ethical doctor or scientist ever would. The family had developed a network of contacts in neighboring towns who would alert them to potential targets. Isolated individuals, travelers, or anyone whose disappearance might not be immediately investigated. This network had allowed them to extend their killing operation far beyond Millbrook, spreading their twisted experiments across the region. The deeper Dr. Harrison dug, the more he realized that the Hartwells had been operating with an almost eerie precision. They had targeted the most vulnerable members of society, using their funeral business to hide their true motives. And with each death, the family had refined their methods, perfecting their grisly art until it became second nature. But as the pieces of the puzzle came together, Dr. Harrison also began to understand something else, something that sent a shiver down his spine. The Hartwells had not been acting alone. They had trained others in their methods, apprentices who had gone on to establish their own operations in different parts of the country. The journal contained references to other families, other funeral directors who had learned from the Hartwells and were continuing their work. The true scope of the Hartwells' influence was far greater than Dr. Harrison had initially realized. The legacy of their crimes had spread across America, and the nightmare they had created was far from over. Dr. Harrison's heart pounded as he realized the gravity of his situation. With every passing hour, the danger increased. He had uncovered the truth, but now, he needed to escape before the Hartwell family discovered what he had learned. The family's sudden, intense silence upon his last visit to the funeral parlor had told him all he needed to know. They knew he was onto them. Every glance, every unspoken word between Ezekiel, Josiah, Caleb, and Rebecca had conveyed a single message: "We are watching you." The unease that had settled over Dr. Harrison during his time in Millbrook had evolved into something far darker. The walls of the town felt like they were closing in on him, and the funeral parlor, once a symbol of professional respectability, now felt like a prison. He had been careful. He hadn't revealed his findings directly to the family, but he knew it wouldn't be long before they pieced together what he had uncovered. They had already shown themselves capable of extreme measures to protect their secrets, and Dr. Harrison feared that if they suspected his investigation was getting too close, they would stop at nothing to eliminate him. He had only one chance to get out alive. The family had left for church early that morning, as they did every Sunday, giving him a small window of time to act. Dr. Harrison knew he had to gather the evidence, make sure it was secure, and leave the town before the Hartwells returned. If he stayed too long, there would be no escaping. Their influence over the town was undeniable, and if he remained in Millbrook any longer, it was only a matter of time before they caught up with him. As he made his way to the basement once more, his nerves were on edge. He had to be quick. The journal, the records, the bodies, everything had to be carefully documented and taken with him. He couldn't leave anything behind. He had already seen the methodical way the family kept records of their victims. If he left the evidence, it would only be a matter of time before the Hartwells destroyed it. The basement was eerily silent, a stark contrast to the chaotic storm raging in his mind. He carefully gathered the journals, the detailed records of the family's crimes, and took photographs of the preserved organs in jars. Each moment felt like an eternity. The weight of the task ahead of him, getting out of the town with the evidence, seemed insurmountable. As he moved quietly through the basement, Dr. Harrison's thoughts raced. He could already hear the footsteps of the Hartwells in his mind, returning from their church service, preparing to confront him. The realization hit him. He wasn't just trying to expose their crimes. He was trying to survive. The thought that they might try to kill him, to silence him before he could get away, made his stomach churn. He had no doubt that they were capable of it. The journal he held in his hands felt heavier now, a reminder of everything that had transpired in the past few days. But as he turned to leave the basement, Dr. Harrison froze. He heard something, footsteps coming from above. The family was back. His heart leapt in his chest, and without thinking, he darted to a small, hidden door at the back of the basement, a passage he had noticed during his earlier visits. It led out to the wooded area behind the Hartwell property, a small gap between the trees where he could escape. But as he slipped into the narrow passage, the door creaked loudly behind him. His pulse quickened. He didn't have much time. The narrow passage wound through the woods, dark and damp. Dr. Harrison moved as quickly as he could, the sound of his footsteps muffled by the underbrush. He had only a few moments to get away, and he had to make it count. If the Hartwells caught him, there would be no escaping. But as he reached the end of the tunnel, a horrifying realization struck him. The path he had chosen led him right toward the mass grave, the very place where the family had disposed of their victims. His mind raced, and for a moment he considered turning back. The path was too dangerous, but there was no time for second-guessing. He had already come this far, and the only way out was forward. The graveyard, a hidden burial site behind the Hartwell property, was eerily quiet. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the unease in Dr. Harrison's chest grew as he scanned the area. He had to move quickly. As he made his way toward the edge of the woods, Dr. Harrison heard the sound of distant voices. The Hartwells were getting closer. They were searching for him. With his heart pounding in his ears, Dr. Harrison knew he had to take the risk. He reached the edge of the forest and ran, making his way across the open ground, praying that he could make it to the main road. His escape depended on it. As he looked over his shoulder, he saw figures emerging from the woods. The Hartwells had found the trail he left behind. Panic surged in his chest as he broke into a sprint, knowing that if they caught him now, it would be the end. Dr. Harrison's legs burned as he pushed himself harder, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He didn't look back again. He couldn't afford to. The main road was ahead, and as he crossed it, he saw a carriage coming from the distance. He flagged it down, desperate for any form of escape. The driver, seeing the fear in Dr. Harrison's eyes, stopped the carriage and helped him into the vehicle. Without a word, the driver whipped the reins and urged the horses to move faster. pulling Dr. Harrison away from Millbrook as the sounds of pursuit faded into the distance. As the carriage sped away, Dr. Harrison collapsed back against the seat, the weight of the past days catching up with him. He had escaped, but the nightmare he had uncovered would never leave him. The Hartwell family was still out there, and now it was up to him to make sure they could never hurt anyone again. Dr. Harrison's escape from Millbrook had come at a great cost. The town, once a peaceful haven where the bonds of community were woven tightly, was now shattered. He had made it out alive, but the horror of what he had uncovered lingered, gnawing at his mind. The Hartwell family had done more than just kill. They had manipulated, experimented, and destroyed lives in ways that defied all understanding. The truth was out now, but even in his fleeting moments of safety, Dr. Harrison knew the hardest part was still to come. The Hartwell family had vanished, and now, his pursuit of them was just beginning. When Dr. Harrison finally arrived in the nearest town, his mind was already racing with the details of what he had uncovered. He immediately made contact with local authorities, but the reception he received was far from the support he had hoped for. The Hartwells were not just a family in Millbrook. They were an institution, and their influence ran deep. Many of the townspeople refused to believe what Dr. Harrison was claiming. The idea that the Hartwells, people so ingrained in the fabric of Millbrook, could be involved in a series of murders was unimaginable to most. Their reputation for caring for the dead, for offering their services even when families couldn't pay, was enough to create an impenetrable wall of loyalty. Dr. Harrison's findings were dismissed by some as wild accusations, fueled by paranoia and fear. Without sufficient evidence beyond what he had seen firsthand, the case was labeled as inconclusive, a tragic misunderstanding that would likely fade into the annals of small-town history. But Dr. Harrison couldn't let it go. His medical training told him that what he had witnessed was far from ordinary. The deaths, the poisons, the meticulous records of the Hartwell family's experiments. It was all too precise, too calculated to be anything other than a series of deliberate murders. Determined to get justice, Dr. Harrison traveled from town to town, following a trail of death that seemed to spread with alarming precision. His pursuit of the Hartwell family was relentless, though each lead he followed grew colder with time. The family's ability to move from one town to another, adopting new identities, had allowed them to escape detection for years. They had been too careful, too methodical. Every time Dr. Harrison thought he was closing in, the family would slip away, leaving behind only whispers and rumors. As Dr. Harrison pursued his investigation, he began to realize that the Hartwell family's disappearance wasn't just an isolated event. It was part of a larger, more disturbing pattern. The family had been on the move for years, leaving behind a trail of death and destruction wherever they went. Every new town they visited, every new funeral parlor they established, seemed to add another layer to their gruesome legacy. In the spring of 1824, Dr. Harrison received word that the Hartwells had been spotted in Ohio. A series of suspicious deaths had been reported in a small town there, and the details mirrored the pattern of deaths that had occurred in Millbrook. Dr. Harrison wasted no time and set off for Ohio, hoping that this time he would finally uncover the truth. When he arrived, he found that the town was in the midst of a deep sense of unease. Several residents had died under strange circumstances, and the local authorities were struggling to make sense of it. The deaths were initially believed to be caused by a fever that had swept through the region, but something about the situation didn't sit right with Dr. Harrison. He began speaking with the townspeople, trying to find any connection to the Hartwells. He learned that the family had established a funeral parlor there, and many of the victims had been prepared for burial by the same people who had helped them in their final moments. Dr. Harrison's investigation soon led him to the discovery of yet another disturbing detail: a mass grave hidden in the woods behind the funeral home. The grave contained the bodies of at least a dozen individuals, all of whom had died under suspicious circumstances. It was clear that the Hartwell family had returned to their old ways, continuing their gruesome operation in a new town. But even as Dr. Harrison moved forward with this new evidence, he found himself facing the same roadblocks as before. The family had already fled, leaving behind no trace of where they had gone. The investigation was once again at a standstill. This pattern of disappearance repeated itself over the next few years. In towns across Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and eventually Missouri, Dr. Harrison tracked the Hartwell family's movements, only to find the same chilling story. Each town had been visited by the family, each time a string of suspicious deaths had occurred, and each time, the family had vanished before Dr. Harrison could gather enough evidence to expose them. The deeper Dr. Harrison dug, the more he realized that the Hartwells had been operating with an almost supernatural level of precision. They had developed a network of contacts in each town, people who helped them identify their targets and cover their tracks. Each new location they moved to was like a fresh start, a clean slate where they could continue their grisly work without attracting attention. The family had become adept at avoiding detection, and Dr. Harrison's pursuit seemed doomed to fail. Each time he got closer, they disappeared into the night. But Dr. Harrison refused to give up. He knew the family's crimes could not go unpunished. Their legacy of murder, spanning multiple states and decades, was too horrific to ignore. As the years passed, Dr. Harrison's obsession with the Hartwells grew. He continued his investigation, piecing together the fragments of the family's history, hoping to find the key that would lead him to them. But even as he pursued them relentlessly, Dr. Harrison was haunted by the knowledge that they might never be caught. His search for the Hartwells would ultimately prove to be a fruitless one. In 1847, nearly 24 years after his first encounter with the family in Millbrook, Dr. Harrison received a letter from a sheriff in Oregon. The letter contained shocking news. The Hartwell family had been exposed in a small town on the West Coast, and their true identities had finally been revealed. It seemed that the Hartwells had moved west, continuing their operation under new names, and had been operating a funeral parlor in Oregon for several years. This time, however, they had been caught. The sheriff's letter detailed their arrest, the discovery of their gruesome records, and their confessions to more than 120 murders. They had been tracked down by the authorities, but not before they had left a trail of death in their wake. For Dr. Harrison, this was both a victory and a haunting realization. The Hartwells had been captured, but the damage they had done was irreversible. The families they had destroyed, the lives they had taken, could never be brought back. The long years of pursuit had finally come to an end, but at what cost? The revelation of the Hartwell family's crimes sent shockwaves through the communities they had terrorized for decades. When Dr. Harrison first uncovered the truth about the Hartwells in Millbrook, he had no idea that his pursuit of justice would become a lifelong obsession. The horror of what the family had done, the systematic killings, the twisted experiments, the manipulation of death itself, was something that no one in the small town could have ever anticipated. The family's capture, after years of evading justice, marked the end of a horrifying chapter in American history. Yet even as the Hartwells were brought to trial, Dr. Harrison couldn't help but reflect on the broader implications of their actions. The town of Millbrook, where he had first stumbled upon the dark secret, was forever changed. What had once been a tight-knit community, bound by trust and familiarity, had now been broken apart. The people of Millbrook would never see the world the same way again. The veil of safety and security they had lived under for so long had been torn away. Dr. Harrison had witnessed firsthand the destructive power of trust misplaced. The Hartwell family had preyed upon the very foundation of their community. People who trusted them with their dead, people who believed in the family's care and compassion. And it was this trust that allowed the Hartwells to carry out their horrific crimes without suspicion for so long. Dr. Harrison had spent years trying to understand how the family was able to manipulate the entire town, and what he had learned haunted him. But the true tragedy lay not just in the deaths the Hartwells had caused, but in the irreversible damage done to the very fabric of the towns they had infiltrated. Millbrook was not the only town to suffer from their deceit. The Hartwells had left a trail of suspicion, fear, and grief wherever they went. Each community they had touched was left grappling with the knowledge that they had been living alongside murderers for years, even decades. The people of Millbrook, as they came to terms with the reality of the Hartwells' crimes, were forced to question everything. How could they have been so blind? How could they have trusted a family that had been so ingrained in their lives, a family that had provided comfort in times of grief and loss? The thought that the people they had trusted most could have been the very ones responsible for so much death was a bitter pill to swallow. For many, it was a reality too horrifying to accept. Dr. Harrison, too, was left with scars that would never heal. He had dedicated his life to serving communities, to ensuring the safety and well-being of those he cared for. But in Millbrook, his discoveries had revealed the darkest side of humanity, a side he had never truly believed existed. The Hartwells had not just killed for money or power. They had killed for the sake of experimentation, for the twisted satisfaction of controlling life and death. This revelation, more than any of the murders themselves, left Dr. Harrison with an unshakable sense of unease. In the years following the family's capture, Dr. Harrison continued to work as a traveling physician, but he was no longer the same man. The horrors he had uncovered had changed him, and he was never able to look at the world the same way again. His colleagues noticed a shift in his demeanor. He became more cautious, more observant, and less willing to trust the people around him. His experiences with the Hartwell case had taught him that evil could hide behind even the most respectable facades. The darkness was not always visible. Sometimes it was cloaked in kindness and professionalism, waiting to strike when least expected. As for the Hartwell family, their fate was sealed. Ezekiel, Martha, Josiah, and Caleb Hartwell were all sentenced to death, their crimes so severe that there was no room for mercy. The trial, which had captivated the nation, revealed the full extent of the family's atrocities. The courtroom was filled with stunned witnesses who had come to terms with the truth of what had happened in their towns. And as each guilty verdict was read aloud, the weight of their actions hung heavy in the air. Rebecca, the youngest of the Hartwell children, was given a lesser sentence, 20 years in prison, due to her youth and claims that she had been coerced into participating in the family's crimes. But even in prison, Rebecca's reputation remained tainted by her family's actions. She would die in prison under mysterious circumstances, her name forever tied to the darkness that had consumed her family. For Dr. Harrison, the story did not end with the Hartwell's capture. The lessons he had learned from the case stayed with him for the rest of his life. The knowledge that people were capable of such evil, and the recognition that evil often hides behind the most innocent of faces, changed the way he approached his work and the way he viewed the world. The final irony, however, lay in the fact that the Hartwells' reign of terror had begun and ended in Millbrook, a town that had once trusted them above all others. In the aftermath, the town struggled to rebuild, but the scars of the past remained. Millbrook, once a symbol of community and trust, had become a place of suspicion and fear. The people who had once relied on each other now looked at one another with wary eyes, forever changed by the dark legacy the Hartwells had left behind. And so, the story of the Hartwell family became a cautionary tale, a reminder that even in the most seemingly peaceful of places, darkness can take root. It showed how trust can be manipulated, how evil can hide in plain sight, and how, in the end, justice may come, but only after years of horror and loss. As the dark legacy of the Hartwell family comes to an end, we're left to reflect on the depths of their deceit and the lives they destroyed. But what do you think? Was the full truth ever uncovered? Could there be even darker secrets that died with the Hartwells? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Do you believe the story ended with their capture? Or is there more to the tale? If this chilling journey into the heart of darkness intrigued you, don't forget to like this video and share it with someone who loves exploring the mysteries of history. Subscribe to the Grave of the Shadows and hit the notification bell, so you never miss another bone-chilling tale. Stay curious, and remember, the past holds many secrets waiting to be uncovered. We'll see you in the next video.